Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Under a Cyber Attack, Learn How to Protect Yourself, presented by Gary Salman, CEO of Black Talon. Hi, my name is Amy DeMarco. I'm the marketing specialist here at Henry Schein, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. Before we begin, I just want to go over one quick housekeeping item, and then I will turn it over to Gary, and he will start his presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions area of your GoToWebinar panel at any time during the presentation, and we will actually address those at the end of the webinar. Other than that, that's pretty much what our housekeeping slides are for today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to Gary, and he will begin the presentation. Gary, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, welcome, everyone. I'm honored to be here today, and I want to thank Henry Schein for hosting this webinar on Under a Cyber Attack, Learn How to Protect Yourself. Let's go ahead and get the screen sharing going, and we'll get the presentation started. All right. So let me give you a little background on myself so you understand who you're speaking with. I've been in the healthcare IT space for almost 30 years. I actually started my career as a programmer, literally from the dorm room of my college. I built one of the very first dental practice management systems out there. And then from there, my company evolved, and in the late 90s, we actually built one of the very first cloud-based systems, believe it or not, where we had thousands of users logging in over the internet and running the practice management software systems off of our servers instead of on-prem servers, which a lot of you may still be using. So I've always kind of been on the cutting edge of technology and solutions for the healthcare market. I also have 17 plus years of law enforcement experience. So if you kind of think about what we do, we're not law enforcement per se, but we're dealing with cyber criminals all the time, because part of what I do is not only prevention, helping practices and organizations just like yourself prevent cyber attacks, but we're also dealing with the victims of those events. So if a practice or healthcare org hospital gets hit with a cyber attack, we can come in and run the whole recovery process, negotiating with the hackers, exchanging Bitcoin for the payment, helping with the decryption of the patient files, and doing a full forensics. So by kind of having this law enforcement background as well as this highly technical background, I think we are able to really understand what's going on from a criminal element and helping to provide proper solutions to better protect organizations just like yours. So let's start off with our agenda. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I like to call the broken mindset. We're going to help you understand really the financial and a big thing that a lot of folks don't think about, the reputational impact of a cyber attack. We'll help you understand who's actually being targeted, because there's a lot of misinformation out there and misunderstanding. A lot of folks say, oh, it's just the hospitals, right? Or it's just the really large practices that are being impacted. It's not the small folks. I'll help you understand that the hackers are really going after everyone. Who's attacking us, where they're coming from, and we'll spend some time on understanding the difference between an IT company or managed service provider and what cybersecurity companies can do for you to help better protect you. And then most importantly, we're going to teach you how to fight back, right? How you can actually build resilient systems to help protect your organizations, protect your patient data. So let's start off with what I like to call the broken mindset. I lecture all over the country. I probably lectured to close to 15,000 healthcare providers and team members in all types of specialties, from small to medium practices up to the large groups and hospitals. And one of the things that I often hear people say to me is, I'm just too small, right? Why are hackers going to come after my practice or my group? How are they ever going to find me? And then the big problem we see right now is, I talked to my IT folks about this. We're covered. I don't have to worry about this. They said that they can protect me. So I'm going to help you understand how that mindset is getting a lot of organizations into trouble. And then risk, right? A lot of folks say, you know what? I'm not going to spend money on cybersecurity because I have an insurance policy. And if I get hit by ransomware, who cares? My insurance will pay out. We'll talk a little bit about the cloud, right? A lot of practices offset risk by moving the data to the cloud. And to help you understand why that may be or may not be a good strategy. Backups. This is another thing that I frequently hear. Practice like, if I get hit by ransomware, I'll just restore my data from backups. Okay, it's a strategy, but what happens if you don't have backups? What if the hackers have stolen all of your patient data? Do backups really even matter at that point? And then this is a big issue. They're like, practices, administrators, folks, that are at an executive level within these groups will often say, well, we just got new firewalls and we have the latest antivirus software, so I'm not too worried about ransomware or theft of my patient data. And then probably one of the biggest ones is what I like to call head in sand syndrome, which is, I don't think this is going to happen to me. I'm going to bury my head in the sand and just pretend everything is fine, and I'm just going to continue on with the way we're currently doing things. Right. So one of the things that I want you to understand is that cybersecurity is not just a piece of software you drop onto your network, right? It's not what we like to call shelfware, where your IT resources are like, oh, here's the latest anti-ransomware protection. We're just going to put this on all the computers and there's nothing to worry about. Just no such thing, right? So what I would like you to start thinking about is implementing a program into your organization. And we're really going to help you understand what a program is in terms of cyber prevention. All right, so how do hackers breach networks? So there are 4 common methodologies. We're really just going to cover 2 in this presentation today because of time constraints. We're going to cover one of the primary ways that your network gets breached is, the first is what's called social engineering, right? Some people call it phishing, spear phishing, scams, trickery, whatever word you want to use. But it's basically when they convince someone at your organization to click on a link, open an attachment, or maybe even give up credentials, like the credentials to access your network, your email, your practice management software, right? Your EMR, EHR, even your VPN access. And then we're going to also focus a lot on network vulnerabilities. This is kind of the hardcore hacking that is going on right now, where the criminals will scan your network, look for vulnerabilities, and try and exploit them in order to gain access to your environment. Third-party risk, this is something you really need to start thinking about. This is when you don't have a direct attack against your network, but an attack occurs where your data is located. It could be at a cloud provider, it could be at a third party that's maybe doing insurance claims for you, labs. Your patient data is there, their healthcare information is there, and they get attacked directly. And because it's your patient data, you could be held liable for that. And then insider threats. This is where an employee at your practice, at your group, purposely tries to steal data, give access to the data to someone from the outside, right? Implement ransomware, extort you. This is a real event. It's not as common in the healthcare space as we see in some other businesses, but it does occur, and we've actually worked cases where an insider has caused an attack against the network, and they've obviously done it purposely. So let's talk about social engineering. I've kind of coined the phrase click risk. This is when hackers try to, once again, solicit a response from someone in your organization. A click, an open, right? A download, giving up information. So there are some common categories here: phishing, spear phishing, smishing, which is a new common methodology that the hackers are using that's gaining popularity right now, which is they send you a malicious link in a text message, and people drop their guard because they feel like, oh, it's just a text message. How bad could it be? Business email compromise, that has a lot to do with like wire fraud. We don't see that too much in the healthcare space, but we do see it from time to time. And then computer tech fraud and phishing, which are basically phone calls to your office to try and solicit information. So let's start with phishing. Phishing is basically the spraying of emails to a large audience to try and solicit a response. They commonly appear to come from things like, or companies like Amazon, Google, American Express, Microsoft, Apple. Why? Because so many people use these technologies, and when you see an email from Apple or Google, you're like, oh, I got to respond to this. and then you end up clicking on things, giving up your credentials, and then the hackers gain access to this type of technology, right? So let's understand the next methodology, spear phishing. Spear phishing is a more targeted attack where they're typically going after managers, directors, executives, doctors of a practice and targeting them for some type of result. So what do you mean by that? Well, it may appear that the email is coming from someone that you do business with, or a practice down the street, or a lab, or a vendor. And because you have relationships with these folks, you're like, oh, this is my referral down the street. This is a lab I use. This is a software company I use. And what happens is, because you're very familiar with these companies, you lower your guard and you give up, right? You basically give up. You're like, oh, click on this link. Sure, it's from someone I know. Oh, they want my username and password to log in. Sure, I'll punch in my username and password. This all makes sense. But what happens? Well, when you take these steps, you're potentially giving full access to someone who is what's called a threat actor, right? A criminal, right? So these types of attacks are very effective, once again, because they're typically coming from someone you know or trust. Another thing that we see often is someone you do business with, or a colleague or a referral, actually has their email systems compromised, and then the hackers notice, oh, look, they send out emails to this practice, to this group. I'm going to craft a similar message with a malicious attachment or malicious link and send it to them. And then the receiver is going to say, oh, this is my friend, Dr. Mary Smith. Let me just click on what she's asking me to do. You can understand how this could result in an attack against your group. This is smishing. This is very, very common nowadays. Hackers will basically just blast any text message like the one you're seeing out to tens of thousands of phone numbers. Right? And they often just increment them. They get the exchanges for those phone numbers, and they do 001, 002, 003, and most of those will probably be cell phone numbers. And then they'll pick a major company, American Express, Chase Bank, Bank of America, things like that. And they're kind of like threatening, warning messages like, hey, we've detected fraud on your account. And you may say, oh my gosh, I'm traveling, across the country tomorrow to a meeting. I need my credit card. I can't have a problem here. You click on the link, it brings you to a web page that looks just like that bank or whatever it might be, and you punch in your credentials. And at this point, you may have just given the hackers access to financials, email, things like that. Third-party risk. We talked a little bit about this already, but this is, or these are companies you deal with. They could be an EMR, EHR vendor, imaging vendors, consultants, dictation companies, outsourcing companies, accountants, attorneys, your IT company, your managed service provider, anyone that has access to your data or stores your data. If they're compromised, your data can be compromised, or they can use their networks to attack your network. Right? So vendor due diligence is a real thing right now. This is where you're supposed to be doing due diligence on these third parties to make sure they have proper cybersecurity in place and proper protection, so it minimizes the risk of a breach at their organization, which could result in a breach at yours. So this is something new I've been talking about. It's called poison downloads and search results. I will share with you a real case in a couple minutes so you understand how this can actually affect you. So basically what happens is you go to look something up, maybe a legitimate company, but hackers buy ads. They use search engine optimization to push their malicious results high up in the search results. And then you click on something and it brings you to a website that you think is the real company. So here's the perfect example. So we received a call about 5 weeks ago from an OBGYN practice, and the doctors were beside themselves. Basically what happened in this case was they were having problems with a printer that they just bought. So one of the doctors took it upon herself to try and fix the problem because they couldn't get their IT company to come in, and she had to print some stuff out. So long story short, this is the real search results that she utilized. She typed in HP tech support, and boom, up pops an ad. She clicks on what she believed at the time was HP's tech support website. So she was brought to a page and it said, please call this number for HP tech support. She dials the 800 number, they answer HP support. She explains her problem, and within a couple minutes, she agrees to set up a screen sharing session. So she assumed a technician from HP support was going to remote into her machine and fix her printing issue. So after about an hour, the technician said, hey, listen, it's getting towards the end of the day. How much more time do you have? She says, look, I have to see one more patient, and then I'm going to be gone for the evening. He said, no problem. I'll have this completely fixed for you by tomorrow morning. So she left him logged into the machine. The next morning, she receives a phone call from her practice administrator saying, hey, we have a problem. We have ransomware all over the network. And she said at that moment, her heart stopped. Literally, she said, I felt like I caused this. And when she went into the practice, all the machines in their practice were completely encrypted with ransomware. And upon further investigation, we determined that the phone number she called was obviously not HP's phone number. It was malicious actors over in a foreign country that had gained remote access. So here's the problem. She allowed them in the system. Almost all the security measures that were put in place to try and prevent this were overridden. Why? Because someone gave them access to it. So one of the things you're going to hear me say throughout the presentation is these events don't always happen the way you think they're going to happen. This was a human mistake, right? She just made a mistake. It's a sad situation, and it cost the practice a tremendous amount of downtime and a tremendous amount of money, right? But they never in a million years thought that they were going to get hit by ransomware because of a mistake a doctor made. Same thing for poison downloads. People will Google, and I've seen this quite a bit, QuickBooks, browsers, pieces of software, and actually end up on a website and download malicious code, right? Not the piece of software they had expected. Exact same concept here. So let's start focusing on technical vulnerabilities. So the way I want to frame this is pretty simple without going into too many technical details. Every device on your network either has a vulnerability, had a vulnerability, or will have a vulnerability. Examples are printers, laptops, tablets, voice over IP telephones, smart devices, servers, workstations, right? Anything that's literally connected to your network. Firewalls on the outside. So what hackers do is they will scan these devices looking for vulnerabilities. A vulnerability is kind of like an unlocked door or window on your home. So let's kind of shift gears to a traditional criminal, someone who maybe does, burglaries. So let's take the example of your house. 2 o'clock in the morning, a burglar drives up, parks his car at the bottom of your driveway, walks up to your house, and starts jiggling the doorknob on your front door, kind of looks around, is like, there's a strong deadbolt on here, I don't want to mess with that. Walks behind your house, looks at your back door and like, there's no deadbolts here. I'm just going to take my heel of my foot, give this door a little kick, and the door is going to fly open, right? Your door is vulnerable. It wasn't properly secured. So conceptually, the hackers do the exact same thing, except they're doing it with pieces of software. They will scan your networks, your environment, your computers without your permission, looking for these vulnerabilities. And if they find them, then they will take specific tools out of their toolkit that are designed to exploit these vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities will then potentially give them access to the machines, to your data, etc. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. So one of the key things to understand is that 60% of the firewalls that we test have vulnerabilities. Your firewall is kind of like your perimeter defense of your home. If this perimeter defense is not properly secured because the device is out of date, there are vulnerabilities on that device that haven't been addressed, a technician made a mistake during configuration, the hackers will find those devices and exploit them. 90% of your internal devices have vulnerabilities, right? And we've scanned hundreds of thousands of computers and thousands of firewalls. And I'm telling you, this data is real, right? This isn't some made up mind data. This is our own internal data. So this is not good odds for a lot of businesses and practices, right? And physicians groups. You understand why so many are being hit, because their networks aren't being properly secured. So one of the things that hackers will do, and what vulnerabilities allow them to do, is move around your network. So if hackers breach your network and gain access to a computer, they will then launch vulnerability scanning tools and other testing tools to say, hey, what other devices on this network are exploitable? And they'll almost use these exploitable devices as launching pads, right? They'll move from machine 1 to machine 2 to machine 3, ultimately getting to the server. So it's something called lateral movement. So by exploiting vulnerabilities, they can move around your network. They can also conduct surveillance once they're on your network. So they'll sit there for weeks. And for most practices, completely undetected, right? There's no alarm bells going off at your MSP or IT company indicating that this is occurring. They will watch what you're doing on your machines. They will understand where your data is stored, whether it's local on a server, in the cloud. They will look at behaviors. What time do people come into the office? What time do they leave? And then once they start having a good idea of how you function as a group, they'll start downloading all of your patient data. Whatever data they can gain access to, they will start stealing it. We're going to talk about why they're stealing your data in a few minutes. On top of it, they will start deploying some very sophisticated software. Understand, we do forensics investigations, so we know firsthand what these hackers are actually doing once they breach these networks. They will deploy tools that crack your passwords to gain access to the server, to gain access to cloud-based systems, etc. They will install screen sharing software, which I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes, which basically enable them to watch everything you're doing. And often they will run software applications that do what is called privilege escalation, which may mean something as simple as this. The person at the front desk only has this much access to the network. But when they run their hacking tools, it allows them to eventually gain access as an administrator. And when you gain access as an administrator to the network, you have everything, right? You can gain access to everything. And once they gain full control and have admin privileges, it's basically game over, right? They're going to have full control over your environment. So one of the other things I want to bring to your attention is something known as known exploitable vulnerabilities. Every couple of days, sometimes more frequently, CISA, which is part of Homeland Security, and it's a cybersecurity and infrastructure agency, releases a list of these known exploitable vulnerabilities. And they're basically saying, hey, every US-based business, be aware that hackers are exploiting these vulnerabilities to break into your networks. So for the first time ever, CISA issued what's called a binding operational directive at the beginning of this year. And it's talking about reducing the significant risk of known exploited vulnerabilities. The directive establishes a CISA-managed catalog of known exploitable vulnerabilities and requires federal civilian agencies to identify and remediate these vulnerabilities on their information systems. You're like, I'm not a federal civilian agency. Okay, that's valid. Most of you probably are not. But then it goes on to talk about, hey, even if you're not a civilian agency, this is something that every single type of business, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments need to review and implement. Many of you may have connections to government funding and things like this. You may need to take a closer look at this. So what's the challenge related to this? Well, the challenge is, I'll say for almost all healthcare entities we deal with, no one has eyes from an IT perspective on these known exploitable vulnerabilities because you just don't have the technology on your network to identify them. So if you can't identify the fact that you have devices on your network that are exploitable, how can you protect your network from threat groups that are exploiting these vulnerabilities? And the answer is as simple as you can't, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about, hey, what type of technology can actually help alert you that, hey, you have some high-risk vulnerabilities in your environment that need to be dealt with before you get hit. So one of the things I'll challenge you right now is, hey, do you know if you have technology in your environment on your computers that identify vulnerabilities? We are not talking about antivirus software. Two totally different concepts. It's like the difference between a car and an airplane, both transportation, but do very different things and function very differently. So how do you address these vulnerabilities, right? How do we deal with these? Well, there is technology that cybersecurity companies can deploy that scan your machines, your laptops, your servers, your workstations every 4 hours for these exploitable vulnerabilities and maybe even unexploitable vulnerabilities that ultimately become exploitable. So kind of the old school approach for many healthcare orgs was, I'm going to scan my network once a year. My IT company will come in and do some tests for me and we'll be good. Then, about 2 years ago, we realized annual scanning, that's useless, right? It's not enough, right? The frequency is too low. Then we started moving to quarterly scans and we realized, all right, that data is out of date very quickly, and we moved to monthly scans. And then what we were seeing once we were doing monthly scans was that some of these vulnerabilities are identified and become exploitable within days, sometimes even hours. So if you're at your kind of 30-day cycle between your scans, you can go 30 days fully exposed. So now the standard of care is really you need to be scanning your machines every couple of hours for these vulnerabilities. Now, you don't have to act on every vulnerability because not every vulnerability requires you to do something immediately, but there are definitely very high risk vulnerabilities that are on almost every single computer that need to be addressed. The other thing that needs to be done from a vulnerability standpoint is they need to be analyzed, right? A lot of practices and groups are just throwing software into their environment and letting it kind of just run autonomously. But cybersecurity isn't just about a piece of software. It's also about humans that know how to analyze this data and act on it. And I think that's a big mistake that a lot of healthcare orgs are making right now is they're just buying software and tools and relying on that and not using credentialed individuals to analyze and assess risk. Your firewall should be scanned at least monthly. I will tell you that good cybersecurity companies are now scanning firewalls daily. You should have a penetration test done. This is when an ethical hacker, a credentialed individual, assumes the role of a cyber criminal and tries to breach your network. They don't have passwords typically, right? They just have an IP address. They're going to simulate an attack from a criminal. Many people have heard about a pen test, but many organizations still don't actually implement one. And then this concept, which we'll talk about a little bit more towards the end of the presentation, this testing really needs to be done by a third party, not by your IT resources or your IT company, right? There needs to be clear distinctions, clear lines between vulnerability testing and remediation, right? So you can't have your IT company saying, oh, we're patching all the problems on your computers and you just taking the word of them, right? You need to have a third party come in that does checks and balances for you. So this is an interesting concept. One of the chief information security officers that we just recently hired came from Department of Defense. He's got his PhD in cybersecurity, and he and I were talking about something, and he said something very interesting to me. He said, what I'm starting to see with so many of these healthcare orgs is they actually don't understand their risk. And it's as simple as no one's telling them what their risk is. So by default, since you don't know your risk and you can't address the risk, guess what? Your IT company is assuming it all for you. And that doesn't work in the healthcare space because if you have a breach, it doesn't matter if your IT company or your IT resources caused it, it's still your patient data and you're still responsible. Even if your data's up in the cloud, right? Can't blame it on that EMR provider. The HIPAA laws are pretty clear, right? It's your data, you're responsible. So if no one's providing you with these reports showing you where you have risk, you can't action on them and you can't make decisions. Probably the craziest story I've ever heard is a healthcare entity up in New Hampshire had attended one of our presentations and immediately ran back to their IT company and said, hey, I'm concerned about cybersecurity. And they're like, oh no, we're doing this all for you. It's fine. And the doctor's like, okay, I've never seen a pen test report from you. I've never seen vulnerability scans. And they're like, oh yeah, so we just actually started doing that. And he's like, well, you told me I'm fine and we're doing all this, but you've never provided any reports. And then he said, well, how come you didn't even approach me with this? And the CEO of the IT company literally told him that, well, we didn't think you wanted to spend the money on it, so we didn't even talk to you about it. Within 24 hours, he fired the IT company. And he called us back. He's like, you're absolutely right. You know, they didn't even have a discussion with me. As the owner of this practice, I didn't even have the ability to make risk-based decisions. This is a huge problem right now, right? If you're not being provided with your vulnerability reports, your pen test reports, you know, on at least a monthly basis, you have no clue conceptually where you have risk, and you're not even given the option of addressing the risk. You can say, look, we don't have the money to address this, right? We're going to put in our 2023 budget and we'll deal with it. Or, wow, look, I don't want to take this risk. We will buy that new server or put in a new firewall or patch these vulnerabilities. These are the types of decisions that you need to be making and not relying on another person to make these decisions for you. So let's understand ransomware and financial impact. So one of the things that cause breaches in many practices is remote access. Doctors, practice administrators, billing folks need to remote into the system in order to be able to look at patient records, do billing, run financials. And often what happens is this remote access is not configured properly, and it's considered extremely high risk. Many of the breaches we see are because remote access is not configured properly. So one of the challenges I have for all of the practices on this presentation today is go back and understand who has remote access into your system, what type of security measures are in place to protect yourself from a potential breach. Hackers can listen to networks or listen for networks that are kind of sending out a little beacon saying, hey, I'm here waiting, who wants to connect to me? And they can scan millions and millions of networks, sometimes in hours or days, looking for this remote connection that's on your network. And then they start honing in on your practice and they're like, oh, here we go. Let me launch my hacking tools against ABC Ortho Group. And then they'll just sit back and wait. They have all the time in the world. They'll just leave their computer running, trying to, hack your usernames, passwords, get into your systems. And if your technology is not configured properly, odds are, with time on their hands, they'll get in. So it's very important you have these conversations. Hey, IT folks, do we have remote desktop protocol enabled? If so, what controls are in place to try and limit the possibility of a breach occurring? Is multi-factor authentication enabled? Is there an account lockout policy enabled that says, hey, after 3 failed attempts to log in, the account should be locked for 15 minutes to try and prevent like this brute force where the hackers try and run tools to guess passwords? These are some of the things that should be in place to try and mitigate a breach in your practice. So, discuss this for a minute or so. Take a picture of this. The other thing that I see is the termination of employees. The doctor's leaving practice, and for some reason, when their employment ends, their remote access does not end. We dealt with a case up in also another New England practice, which happened to be there, where they terminated an employee. It was not on good terms. She remoted back into the office and did some pretty significant damage to their EMR system, right? Where she got in, she was actually able to change the name and address on the monthly statements to another practice in the area just to be malicious. All right, they ended up working with law enforcement and the FBI on that case. All right, not a good situation. It impacted hundreds and hundreds of patients. So who is being targeted by ransomware? And as I started off my presentation, I kind of said most practices say it's someone else. It's not me, it's the group down the street, it's the hospital, it's the really large groups. And I will tell you often it's the opposite. The very large physicians groups often have pretty substantial cybersecurity in place. The hospitals have obviously invested pretty heavily in security unless they're smaller entities. So where does that leave the small and medium groups? Exposed. And the hackers know this, right? They know if they want to go after a hospital, it's going to be a lot of time, a lot of resources to try and break in. but many of these smaller physicians groups, just like many on this call today, you haven't invested in cybersecurity. You haven't done the testing to help ensure that your network is properly secured. And they know often with hours or days worth of work, they're going to get into your network. All right, so this is a pretty common piece of knowledge that the hackers have. And they also know, hey, I can hit 2, 3, 4 smaller healthcare groups. That may result in ransom payments that are larger than just one big hospital. I also want you to understand that ransomware, which basically locks and encrypts the files on the network so you can't access them, is destructive. In many cases, ransomware actually damages the operating systems on your computers. So what does this mean? Your computer may not boot properly, it's not going to function properly, it's been compromised, the hackers can watch what you're doing, and it often requires the rebuilding of every computer in your practice. Imagine right now you getting word from someone in your office that we got hit with ransomware and it is systemic. Every machine in the environment has been impacted, every server, every workstation. Now imagine having to re-image and rebuild every one of those computers. It is a tremendous amount of downtime and resources, and a lot of dollars are associated with that type of recovery. So we've been throwing around the word ransomware, and I think some people have a general concept, especially if you've been a victim, and a lot don't. So ransomware is really malicious code that hackers engineer and deliver to your network either through click risk, right, which is your employees, or through these vulnerabilities. And once this ransomware gets into your environment, your network, it starts encrypting every single file typically, every patient record, every PDF, every Word document, every health history form, right? Every database, you get the idea. And what happens is when it encrypts it, it puts a lock on the file. So you kind of see the files there, but when you go to open it, they're encrypted. The computer cannot view them. And encryption is so powerful right now that no one can typically break encryption. Even supercomputers owned by the government can't break the latest forms of encryption. So you're done, right? You're now being forced to probably pay the ransom in order to get your data back. I will also tell you that many forms of ransomware will autonomously offload all of your data in your environment back to the hacking groups so they can then extort you. So let's just say you have recoverable backups. And then you say to yourself, let's just restore the backups, and you don't communicate with the hackers. The hackers will then say, hey, we haven't heard from you in a while, so listen, that makes sense. You probably don't want to pay us because you have backups, but we're going to start leaking all of your patient data. We'll show driver's licenses, insurance cards, health history forms, EOBs, lab reports to the world, and then come back and talk to us. And then maybe you're going to rethink not paying us. This is how the extortion methodology works with these hacking groups. And then what happens? Almost every physician's group and hospital's like, oh, we can't have this data leaked. This is going to be a disaster. All this healthcare information and personally identifiable information out on the dark web, we're going to have to pay. Even though we have backup so we can get our network back up and running, we're still going to pay. And believe it or not, that's what most law firms are still advising. Like, hey, you can't leak this data, so you may want to consider paying the ransom. I will tell you, even for a very small practice, pick a plastic surgery or small derm practice, this type of event will easily cost you 6 figures. Some practices may get away with 100,000, and we have small practices that have to pay out, close to $1 million, believe it or not. And then as you get bigger, it could be in the millions. All right, so this is no joke what's going on right now. And then you have reputational harm. Imagine being in a practice where maybe you have full body shots of patients, right, because of plastic surgery, dermatology, right, other types of surgery. You have driver's licenses, insurance cards. What if that information was released? Patients can be very vindictive. They go on social media, they go to these review sites for doctors and practices and post about the fact that they just received a letter from their practitioner indicating that the data has been compromised. So understand that these events are a lot bigger than most people think or understand. So our data, and you can search this is a pretty standard number, indicate that about 75% of the time a practice has their patient data stolen. Not good odds, all right? The actual ransomware payment for a very small practice starts at around 45 grand. Yes, sometimes it's a lot less, and sometimes it is actually a lot more. I will also tell you that in many instances, the hackers, if they have the email addresses, phone numbers of your patients, your employees, your vendors, suppliers, will actually start contacting them directly saying, hey, we hacked the practice of ABC Ortho. They're not paying us, right? We're going to release your information. We want you to pay us $5,000 to prevent that. Right? We had an orthopedic group down in the Southwest a little over a year ago where this is exactly what happened. They actually went after the staff, a decent sized staff, about 45 employees, and the group didn't have enough money. The ransom payment was over $1 million. They started emailing the employees and doctors at the practice saying, your bosses refuse to pay us. We have your home address, your social, your date of birth. If you don't encourage them to pay us, we're going to do identity theft on you individually. So now the practice is in total chaos because of the ransomware attack. And now you have doctors, nurses, right, staff that are literally freaking out because they are being targeted by this hacking group out of Russia. So what's the financial impact? So I will tell you, for most healthcare orgs, it's not the ransomware payment that is the biggest financial impact. It's the loss of business operations, known as business continuity, where you just can't function as a practice. So you have to close your doors. I will tell you that most healthcare organizations will shut their doors for 2 weeks. Your computers will not be operational for a 2-week period. So sit back and think for a second and say to yourself, what would the impact be to me, my group, if we had to close for 2 weeks? So I think most of you, depending on the size of your org, will say, yeah, 45 grand's rough to pay out for ransom, but not being able to treat patients for 2 weeks, that's going to hurt. Now I want you to think about how much you rely on your computers. So imagine not being able to schedule new patients, but what's even worse than that? Seeing who's coming in that day. All of a sudden, all these patients are showing up. You have no idea what they're coming in for. Can't access any of their records. And then they come in because that's their scheduled appointment. You're like, hey, I'm sorry, your computers are down. And they're like, well, I took the whole day off from work. I got a babysitter, right? Now you're telling me you can't see me? You can understand the slippery slope that occurs. Can't even reschedule them. Can't access your labs, your imaging, your clinical notes, claims. All of this is encrypted by the hacking group. So one of the exercises I like to take you through is think about all the things we just discussed, all the items that you rely on from a computer perspective. Your billing systems, right? Your EMR, your financial packages, your HR for human resources, your accounting, maybe text messaging, your phone systems. For many practices, there's at least 10 different systems that are now run by your computers. And when you don't have access to these computers, can't access those systems. We've had practices whose phone systems have been shut down for 5+ days, and they were forwarding phone calls to people's cell phones to try and just keep up with the inbound phone calls. So one of the other items that is very troubling and is trending right now is the deployment of screen sharing software by the hacking groups. A majority of the time, when we start doing forensics investigations, we find out that the hackers deployed screen sharing software into these healthcare orgs. So what does that mean? What's the impact? Well, let's start with what does it mean? They take off-the-shelf legitimate screen sharing programs like TeamViewer, GoToMyPC, SplashTop, many of these applications you may have heard of. They put them on your network. Now, these are legit pieces of software. So I want you to think for a second. Do you believe your firewall is going to block this? Do you believe your antivirus software is going to detect it? The answer is most likely no. Why? They're legit pieces of software. They have legitimate business purposes. So now they get the screen sharing software on your network, and sitting over in a foreign country, they click on the icon on their desktop, boom, they connect right to a computer in your office, or in many cases, all the computers. and they just sit back there and they watch. They watch all the cloud sites you go to. They watch you open your emails. They watch you compose emails, read emails. And then you know what they do? Around midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, they log back in. They open up your browser and they'll open up your email, right? They'll go to many of the websites you frequent. And you know what your computer often does? When you visit a website, take Amazon.com. First time you go to it from a new computer or a new browser, Amazon prompts you to do what? Authenticate, punch in your username, your password, maybe even multi-factor authentication, and then it drops a token on your machine and says, hey, I trust this computer. You're good. So what do the hackers do? They open up that browser. They go to, for instance, your browsing history. They're like, oh, they just accessed Amazon.com. They click on it, and boom, they're in your Amazon account. You might sit back and be like, who cares? Whatever. So they're going to see that I ordered some pants and shirts, whatever. That's not really the point. The point is now they have access to something that's yours. Let's take it one step further. When you open your email, does it prompt you for your username and password every single time you open your email? I will tell you for probably 95% of you on this call, it does not. So now imagine the hackers at 1 o'clock in the morning opening up your email. What if you have communications in that email regarding your patients? Directly with the patient, with a referral, with a colleague, internal emails? Could you potentially have a breach now through your email? Absolutely, we see it all the time. All right, so we have to think a little differently here. We have to understand, hey, maybe all your data is in the cloud. Let's take this example. They look at the browsing history, they see you access abcemr.com. That's your EMR system. What if an employee stores the username and password in the browser? So you know what the hackers do? They click on that browsing history, they go to that website, your EMR system opens up, prompts for the username and password, and then the browser instantly inserts the username and password, and then the hacker just clicks log in, and they're in. When I say that to a lot of practices, you can see the body language change. So like never in a million years thought about that, okay? This is how the hackers are getting around a lot of security measures. Once they get into your system, it's usually game over, all right? So I'm not against cloud technology. I'm a firm believer in it, and I think it's great, but I think a lot of folks are just completely offsetting risk by moving to the cloud without understanding the risk of not securing your workstations in your practices. All right, so we talked a lot about this already, gaining access to your different systems, but the one big thing I want to bring up is the disabling of your computer's defenses. Because they're remoting into your system, depending on what access that employee has, meaning what privileges they have on that computer, are they an admin, are they a user, what types of shares do they have to access data on the network? The hacker can literally go in and say, oh, look at that antivirus software. I'm just gonna right click on this thing and shut it down. In many investigations that we do, we find that the hackers do exactly that. They disable the computer's defenses. They shut down the antivirus software. They escalate privileges. They deploy their hacking toolkits through these screen sharing apps. Once again, like I said, a lot of people don't think of this occurring this way. They don't envision an attack occurring. They're all thinking it's just going to be a click and it's going to be one of my employees screwing up. It's often a lot more than that. So this is a group we did up in Massachusetts, 6-location group. They're actually 4 different corporations for legal reasons, entities, but they were all sharing data. There are 6 partners in this group. They had 4 servers, 80 workstations, multiple imaging systems, 2 different practice management softwares, EMR, right? They were down for 9 straight days. I will tell you that the attack was so significant that it hit every single computer in their environment. Every laptop, every server, every computer, their diagnostic equipment, everything was taken down. They had no infrastructure left for almost 9 days. The hacking group walked off with 190,000 patient files from the practice. The interesting thing about this attack was shortly after my security guys got in, I received a phone call from one of them and they're like, hey, we got a problem here. I said, what's that? They said, you remember the hacking group that the FBI just recently took down? I said, yep. And they said, it appears to be almost the identical code, just modified a little bit. We ended up reaching out to the FBI. The FBI confirmed, in fact, that they were just starting to track this group, and it's a reincarnation, right? The group that they took down is defunct, but the code survived, and the hackers came back, stood up new infrastructure, new servers on the dark web, modified their code a little bit, and we're back in business. Now, this group was only the second victim in the United States. Wasn't a Fortune 100 company, wasn't a multi-billion-dollar entity. It was just regular old healthcare group, right? Very, very significant event for this organization. I will tell you that it cost them close to $1 million, all right, to deal with. So what are the waterfall effects? This is something a lot of people don't think about. When your patient data gets stolen or your email addresses get compromised, that presents hackers with future targets. So what they'll do often is they'll grab all your data, first name, last name, date of birth, email address. They'll sit on that for a few months. And then they start creating emails that look like they're from your practice. And then they start targeting your patients. And the patient's like, oh, this is my primary care physician. This is my dermatologist. This is my endocrinologist. Well, let me see what they want me to open or click on or review. Or I have a new bill. I don't really remember having an open balance. Let me click on this thing. And then they become victims or they give up credentials. Now you have a really big problem, right? And hackers can also leverage it for identity theft purposes. So now they target your patients directly and they perform identity theft on them because sometimes patients just make mistakes. They're like, oh, my primary care wants my social security number to update their healthcare records. No problem. Let me punch this data right in. They give the hackers that information. So let's understand the differential between IT and cybersecurity. I believe this is one of the primary reasons so many healthcare orgs are in fact compromised. So almost every healthcare org has either internal IT or external IT, right? An IT company, a managed service provider. And these companies are great, right? They keep you up and running, they fix things when they break. They're there to support your employees and doctors when there's a problem with the system. But one of the issues that we see is that these IT companies hang a shingle on the wall, right, of their office and concept or on their website and say, hey, we do cybersecurity now. And then as a manager, administrator, doctor in the practice, you're like, oh, great, IT company's doing cybersecurity now. But truth be told, there's no definition for cybersecurity. Anyone can say they do cybersecurity. There's no credentialing for the word cybersecurity, no definition per se that is considered industry standard. So tomorrow, 18-year-old person can go out and be like, I'm a cybersecurity expert and be one of those in concept. So as a practitioner, you hear all the right things and all the right terminology per se, you don't really understand, and you're like, all right, give me cybersecurity. And a day later, your IT vendor's like, hey, we got you secure. But then when you start digging into it, you're like, oh, by the way, do you guys have credentials? Like, how do I know you really know what you're doing? No one seems to ask that question. There are legitimate board certified security engineers that have the credentials CISSP or HCISPP, right? These are individuals who have to typically be working in the security field for many years and then go to a nonprofit organization to take a test to verify their knowledge on cybersecurity. I will tell you, many managed service providers and IT companies don't have anyone with these credentials, but yet they say they do cybersecurity. The IT company is kind of like the generalist, the internist. The cybersecurity company is the specialist, right? They are the cardiothoracic surgeon, right? Both doctors, the internist and the surgeon, but serve very different roles in the healthcare space. Both are critical, right? You're not going to go to a cardiothoracic surgeon for, a primary care situation, right? You don't feel well, you're tired, you're sick, you get the idea, and vice versa. The internist isn't going to do open heart surgery. All right, so we have to understand that there's an importance here for both IT and cyber. Once again, a piece of software being deployed on your network or upgrades to your firewalls is not cybersecurity. It's a feel-good thing and sounds good and looks good on a piece of paper, but it isn't a solution. And then the auditing of their own work, right? We've focused on this a lot. You have to have checks and balances. You can't just have your IT company saying, we've got you secured, you're good, and you go back treating your patients. It doesn't quite work that way. So conceptually, you can't have the fox guarding the hen house. You need a third party to come in and verify whether or not your devices, your firewalls, your servers are in fact secure, and if they're not, provide steps to help secure those devices. So one of the things that we often don't hear is the emotional. Cover the reputational, but the emotional impact. We've dealt with hundreds of doctors and groups that have been hit with ransomware. And one of the things that doctors will typically say to me a year, 2 years later, okay, I got PTSD from this stuff. Every day I walk into my practice and I'm wondering, am I going to see the red skull and crossbones on my computers again, right? I almost lost my livelihood, on that day. And they struggle, right? Because it's tough, right? You're relying on your people and your IT vendor to make sure you're secure, and you kind of don't have control, right? So a lot of times we don't think about these things, we don't talk about it, but it takes a very significant emotional and physical toll, not only on the doctors, but administrators and sometimes even the staff, right? We've gone on site and dealt with some of these practices, and we've had administrators, employees pull our security guys aside and be like, hey, am I going to lose my job over this? Right? I think I may have clicked on something. Are you guys looking at me? It's rough for sure. We talked a lot about cloud security already. As I said, I'm a proponent of it, but understand just because the data's in the cloud doesn't mean it's secure. The companies providing that cloud technology have to do their own work. They have to provide proper security. It needs to be audited by a third party, just like your practice needs to be. And you need to start asking them tough questions like, hey, can you provide me with some proof that you guys are having a third party secure your environment, so that way your breach doesn't become my breach? I do believe in cyber insurance. I think every healthcare org should have insurance. The amount of coverage is really going to be dependent on the size of your org and the number of patients and your revenue for the year. Check with your insurance carriers, your malpractice carriers, and make sure you have proper coverage. Even if you have cybersecurity in place, you need to have insurance. But more importantly, if you have insurance, you need to have cybersecurity. We talked a little bit about backups already, but understand that in many cases, the hackers will find your backups, whether they're local on your network, in your practice, or in the cloud, and they will destroy them. Because they know if you have backups, there's a higher likelihood you may not pay them, but also understand if they steal your data, there is a propensity for the practices to have to pay because they don't want the release of the data. So how do we fight back? How do we build these resilient systems? So we'll start wrapping up here. Cybersecurity is a team approach, hands down, one of the most important things. You can't just have your IT company doing security. You can't just tell your doctors and your team, hey, don't click on links or open attachments, and you can't just hire a cyber company to secure you. It's all three entities coming together, working hand in hand to provide security. That's how it works. 10 ways to build a resilient system, very simple. Always have unique, strong passwords across your entire environment. Never reuse passwords. Get a password manager like LastPass or Dashlane that creates unique, strong passwords for every website and every application you use. Any application, any website that supports multi-factor authentication where it sends like a text message to your phone or pops up an app, you must implement that. Financial institutions, email, practice management software. Encrypt data at rest. Check with your EMR systems to make sure they support this. But wherever your data relies, or lies, not relies, I misspoke. Wherever your data lies, that hard drive should be encrypted. So if someone physically steals that server, or if that device is lost for whatever reason, technically they can't get at your data. Understand it means it's data at rest. So if the computer's booted up, the hard drive encryption doesn't really do anything. Make sure you have online and offline backups, right? Just having backups in the cloud or just on an external hard drive isn't really adequate. You must conduct a security risk assessment. I highly recommend this is done by a third party, and it's done by a credentialed individual, someone with those CISSP or HCSPP credentials. You must, under federal law, conduct cybersecurity awareness training. It's part of HIPAA. It's not a matter of buying pizza or sending out an email warning everyone. It is an actual process and a training platform that educates and empowers your entire team. Vulnerability management. We started out the whole presentation talking about how critical managing and addressing vulnerabilities are. If you're not receiving monthly reports addressing your vulnerabilities and identifying vulnerabilities, you're missing a huge component of cybersecurity. We talked about the pen test, extended detection and response. This is very important. I'm telling you from my personal experience and the experience of our company, many of your insurance companies are now requiring something called EDR or XDR to be in your environment. This is artificial intelligence technology that can help identify an attack and autonomously block it or at least minimize the impact, right? So you want EDR or XDR. It's a replacement for traditional, what I'll call old school antivirus software. And then once again, seek specialists that specialize in cyber, not just IT resources. This is a great screen to take a photo of or a screen capture. This is kind of isolating. Hey, these are the things your IT company should be doing, and these are the things that a cybersecurity company should be doing, and really helps identify the checks and balances. So one of the things that I'll challenge you to right now is what's missing from your security layer. If you really don't have every piece of this matrix, you're really at risk, right? And believe it or not, this is kind of like the minimum nowadays. There's obviously a lot more things you can do, but this is what everyone should be doing. You have to be build resilient systems. Security isn't just like a single layer, it's this multi-layered approach. It's not only the lock on the little doorknob on your house, it's a deadbolt, it's cameras, it's an alarm system. You know, maybe you have a dog, lights, right? That's how you make your home conceptually less of a target. You want to do the same thing with your networks. You want the hackers to scan your network, you know, test your employees, and then say, there's not much here, I'm going to move on to the next practice. But the reality is you have to stand up for yourself, right? You can't be passive, submissive, and be like, I think I'll be fine, all good, I'm not going to worry about this. All right, so with that being said, just finished on time, which is awesome. I want to share with you my contact information. I'm an open book. I help practices of all types and sizes all over the country help secure their environments. So if you have any questions, concerns, you want to drop me an email, run something past me, happy to do so. We also offer free consultations to help you understand kind of where you are on a risk scale. So happy to offer that up to all the attendees as well. But at this point, just want to see if we have any questions, happy to address those. So there is a little question window. So I'll give you a minute or two if you have any questions. If you need me to explain anything, happy to do that. If not, we will start wrapping up. But thank you so much for taking your time today. I genuinely hope you learned something. This is a community effort, right? So we all have to work together to try and secure these environments. So hope you got something out of it. Thank you. So give it a second and see if there are any questions.
Hi, Gary, this is Amy. Right now, there is currently no questions.
Okay, sounds good. Give it another 30 seconds, Amy, and then I think we'll call it a day.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so it looks like we have one question. Let me just pop the window up here.
He's asking about pricing.
Yeah, so Dr. Randy's asking about pricing. So it really depends on the size of your organization. For smaller healthcare entities, we usually charge per physical location. So for argument's sake, if you're under 100 computers in your environment, some of the security measures that I've mentioned start at like $299 a month and kind of work their way up. If you're a larger org over 100 computers, then we usually charge per computer. It can be anywhere from a couple dollars to $20 per computer per month, depending on the technology that needs to be implemented in your practice. the size of the organization, obviously, the amount of data you have, and you may have some technologies already in place by your IT resources. So basic answer is $299 and up. So. All right, so one person said, I've seen, I'm not going to mention the name, but an XDR software for $9 a month. Yes, right. So there are some shelfware, which we kind of talked about, some EDR, XDR software that you can drop into your environment that replaces your antivirus software. But keep in mind, these are good technologies, but these technologies are designed to act after someone has breached your network. So the concept here with cybersecurity is, let's try and prevent someone from getting into your network. And then if that fails for whatever reason, because nothing's 100%, right? If that fails, then hopefully these types of technologies, these EDR and XDR technologies will take over and potentially stop an attack. But for instance, antivirus software, this EDR, XDR typically doesn't stop the theft of your patient data, right? So that might fill a little part or resolve a little bit of the issue from a security standpoint. But this is kind of what I was talking about. If we rely just on a singular technology, that's typically why practices fail. It's this holistic, multi-layered solution that's really what you're looking for. So, but thank you for adding that. Okay, and then the next question is some of the discussions we just had. Are they reviewed during an initial consultation? The answer is yes. So during initial consultation, we'll ask you like, hey, how big are you? What type of technology is in place from a security perspective? You know, what's your perceived risk? Have you had a problem previously that you want to discuss, et cetera? And then, you know, depending on the size of your org, you know, many solutions are custom, right? Based on the size, patience, and risk. If you're a smaller org, many times, hey, this is kind of like a cookie cutter solution because this is the minimum that you'll need. But yes, great question. All right, that looks like it for questions. So if we want to wrap up, that would be great. So once again, thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thank you, Henry Schein, for educating your your customers. Sorry. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it. Everyone have a good day.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.